In this video, we'll be taking a look at J.B. Priestley's And Inspector Calls with a particular focus on context, the characters, and Priestley's purpose, because for more so than for any of your literature texts, authorial intent and authorial purpose is more important than any of your other texts, really. And what Priestley is trying to do with this play should be the driver of all of your answers in the exam. With that in mind, it's important to consider the context both in which the play is set and in which it was written and first received. It's interesting contextually because it's set in 1912, Edwardian England, but it is written and first performed in 1946, which is post-World War II Britain. And that's important for when you're writing, because if you're talking about audience reaction, you are not talking about a 1912 audience. You're talking about a 1946 audience. You could, of course, refer to the setting and the time period in which it's set and tell us what it reveals about 1912 society, but audience reaction will be an audience of 1946, and they're very, very different. So England in 1912. The First World War is 2 years away, and the Titanic sinks later that year. For those of you familiar with the play, you'll know that those 2 points are important in terms of some of the things Mr. Burling says. There is a rigid class structure with the upper and middle classes having no appetite to change. They're very comfortable in their positions and looking to protect them. It's a patriarchal society, so there's a gender divide in which women are subservient to men, and it is very much a society concerned with appearances. So England in 1946 is a very, very different place. The Second World War has just ended, and this is a time of significant austerity in the UK. With rationing and poverty, and Britain is kind of bankrupt at the end of World War II, and it's the poorest British society has been for quite some time. It's not long after the Great Depression between 1929 and 1939, a period of really high unemployment and increased poverty. The class distinctions are significantly reduced from what they were in 1912 because of the collective effort of World War II. And also because of World War II, women have a much more valued place in society, and particularly in the world of work, having taken on some of the what were deemed more masculine roles as the men were away at World War II. And it is a society not that has changed, but that Priestley sees as having the potential for social change. And shortly after this, Clement Attlee's Socialist Labour Party won a landslide victory over the more right-wing Conservative Party led by Winston Churchill. So Priestley is well aware of the society he's writing for, and he sees it as one with the potential for change, but one which needs to hear that message. And that is the message he's trying to get across in the play. One of the key areas of context, and something you have to understand, is the distinction between capitalism and socialism to really understand this play, because Priestley is driving a socialist message, wants to see an end to capitalist ideology and an acceptance of a more socialist ideology. So capitalism, as the definition says here, an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. What does that mean? Well, it's a system which is driven by the accumulation of individual wealth, which means that it is a system governed by self-interest with a relative lack of social responsibility and a materialistic focus on the individual. Socialism, on the other hand, is a system where society's wealth is shared more equally, where community is valued over individualism, and one in which there is a smaller divide in class and wealth. It's not a perfect system, but it sounds perfect, but it isn't. But it's certainly one where there is a greater sense of social responsibility and community than there is in a capitalist system. And it's these ideologies that Priestley is seeking to drive throughout the play. This is an allegorical play, an Inspector Calls, and as it says here, an allegory is a literary device or artistic form which is a visual representation in which a character, place or events can be interpreted to represent a hidden meaning with moral or political significance. And of course you will know that an Inspector Calls has both moral and political significance. Priestley is trying to drive home both a moral and a political message. So places and settings can have symbolic significance, and characters are often vehicles who carry the author's moral or political message. And we'll have a look now at the way in which Priestley is utilising setting and character to drive those messages to his audience. So the setting is the Burling house, and it's the dining room of the Burling house. It's described in the opening stage directions, and actually I would encourage you to spend quite some time looking at the stage directions, because this is how Priestley wants his setting and his characters to be perceived. So it's a fairly large suburban house with good solid furniture of the period. The general effect is substantial and heavily comfortable, and it's set out with champagne glasses, decanter of port, cigar boxes, amongst other things. Let's consider some of these then. So it's clearly a setting which symbolises capitalist wealth. It's a fairly large suburban house. The furniture is reasonably impressive, and the table is laid with items which suggest wealth and prosperity and class. But we can see that Priestley is immediately looking in some ways to undermine that. If Priestley wants us to reject capitalism, he has to undermine the capitalist ideology in the play, and that starts with the setting. It is a fairly large suburban house. It is probably not as large as the one Mr. Burling would like to own. The general effect is substantial and heavily comfortable, and that oxymoron, heavily comfortable, suggests that there's something not quite right about this furniture. So Priestley's looking to call it into question, I think, from the very beginning. And then we have the symbol of capitalism in the play, and that's Mr. Burling, and he's described in the opening stage directions as a rather portentous man. He's a bit arrogant, actually. Burling describes himself as a hard-headed man of business. He is defined by work. He is defined by the making of money. He's also defined by that sort of capitalist drive towards self-interest. A man has to look after himself and his family, and he dismisses the idea of community as if we're all mixed up together like bees in a hive. Bees, of course, work towards a common purpose, which is very much in line with a socialist society. Mr. Burling dismisses this entirely. Now, Priestley is well aware of the society he's writing for. He's writing for an audience in 1946, which has just come together for a collective effort during World War II. So Burling dismissing that notion causes the audience to react against him immediately, and in reacting against Mr. Burling, they are encouraged to dismiss his capitalist ideology. Even in his moment of expressing remorse, Burling does it in an entirely capitalist sense. I'd give thousands, yes, thousands, he says to the inspector. So even when he's feeling remorse for the death of Eva Smith, his feelings are underpinned by thoughts of money and commerce. So if Burling is the symbol of capitalism and capitalist ideology, it is essential that Priestley undermines him in the eyes of the audience so that we dismiss not only the character but his ideology too. He is described in the opening stage directions. Well, his wife is described as being her husband's social superior. Immediately Burling is undermined because in a patriarchal society where the man is supposed to be dominant, here we are told that he is the social subservient of his wife. And then Priestley allows, very cleverly, he gives Burling the floor in Act 1, and Burling dominates the dialogue completely with all his long speeches. But Priestley only allows Mr. Burling that time on stage so that he can undermine himself and undermine his own ideas. He says that the Titanic is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, and that there isn't a chance of war. This is where the context is interesting, because Burling is speaking 2 years before World War One begins and he's speaking before the Titanic sinks, but the audience is watching after both of those events. This is a moment of dramatic irony, where the audience knows something that the characters on stage do not. And Berling's rhetoric is therefore rendered naive and almost idiotic, and he's undermined completely. His confidence is undermined, his authority is undermined. It's a very clever ploy by Priestley. But even right at the end, Priestley allows Berling one more moment of glory, where he thinks that the inspector is a hoax, and he mocks Gerald and he mocks Sheila and Eric, the famous younger generation who know it all. And so he allows Berling to elevate himself one last time, but he only does that in order to bring him crashing down, because it's at that moment that the phone rings and they learn the truth that the inspector is coming to visit them, and Berling is brought crashing back down to earth. So Priestley allows Berling the floor. He allows him these moments of elevation and glory, but only in order to bring him crashing down, so that we reject his capitalist ideology. Mrs. Berling is a symbol of wealth and the higher classes, but more a symbol of old money rather than Berling, who's a symbol of new money. Berling's made his own money. And I don't think Priestley wants us to reject that idea, but he wants us to reject the greed and arrogance that comes with it. Mrs. Berling, similarly, she's a symbol of money and class. Her husband's social superior. She's a rather cold woman, which suggests that she's a symbol of the slightly unfeeling upper classes. She has no sense of public responsibility at all. I accept absolutely no blame whatsoever. And she thinks that she's indestructible as a member of this sort of upper middle class, this wealthy upper middle class. She feels protected in some way. If you think you can bring to bear any pressure on me, Inspector, you are quite mistaken. There's an absolute arrogance and confidence in her belief that she is protected and she's immune from the outside world. But as he does with Mr. Berling, it's crucial for Priestley that in the eyes of the audience, Mrs. Berling is reduced in some way. And he does that really cleverly through her stage directions in her interactions with the inspector. If we have a look at these are in order during her interaction with the inspector. She starts off smiling and social. She's very, very comfortable and confident. She's then rebuking the others. She's telling the others off, exerting her authority. But then you can see the inspector start to break her down. We then get, after pause, recovering herself, alarmed, stung, agitated now, rather cowed, rather agitated now, and then finally understanding now. The inspector has got through to her, and there is a realization from Mrs. Berling of her involvement, what she's done, what her son Eric has done in particular. So the stage directions are used in Act 2 to reduce Mrs. Berling from her position of superiority, and it's essential that she's reduced in the audience's eyes in order that we reject her ideology too. And that brings us nicely on to the inspector. And the inspector is probably the most important character in the play because he represents really Priestley's voice and the voice, and he's a representative figure and a voice for the working classes as well. These are his opening stage directions. The inspector enters and Edna goes, closing the door after her. The inspector need not be a big man, but he creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness. He is a man in his 50s dressed in a plain darkish suit of the period. He speaks carefully, weightily and has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. The important bits here is that he creates at once an impression of massiveness. He doesn't have to be a big man, but he creates a presence on stage. And that's really, really important. He's a huge figure because he's more than just a man. He's more than just a character. He's Priestley's mouthpiece on the stage. He is delivering Priestley's message. And he's also the character which represents all of the working class who are otherwise denied a place and a voice and a position within this play. So he's this metaphorical, symbolic character who has so much more significance than just being a man on the stage. And that's why he is described as creating an impression of massiveness. He must also be a huge presence on stage, because it's crucial for Priestley that we listen to his message and we hear what he has to say, because he is delivering Priestley's message in the play. His clothing is interesting too, his costume. He's dressed in a plain, darkish suit of the period. It is unremarkable because he is a generic representative figure. He's representing everyone in the working classes who aren't in the world of this play, but are outside of the world of this play. And so his costume marks him as this generic representative character. And we can see how he becomes Priestley's socialist voice in the play. He tells Mr. Burling it is better to ask for the earth than to take it. He also tells him that public men have responsibilities as well as privileges. And then we get the real message about socialism and social responsibility in his leaving speech. And I would encourage you to take some time to have a look at the inspector's leaving speech in detail, but here are 3 quotations. He says, "There are millions and millions and millions of John Smiths and Eva Smiths still out there." Well, John Smiths and Eva Smiths, they're representative figures for the working classes, and the repetition of millions there confirms the extent of the working class in its size, but also the extent of the suffering that is being endured by the working classes because of a capitalist system which is favoured by Mr. and Mrs. Burling. He then says we are members of one body, which is perhaps his most notable line in the play, because bodies are made of, as you will know, atoms and molecules and muscles and cells, and every tiniest element of the body comes together to help it function and make it work. And so there is a message about society. Every single member of that society is crucial in order to help it work. And one thing he's asking his audience and people like Mr. Burling to consider is that those smaller members of society, as Mr. Burling perceives them, are crucial to help him make money. Everyone is just as important as everyone else. And without even the seemingly smallest member of society, society ceases to function. And then his final brilliant line where he says, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. And this is a line which very much resonates with the audience of the time, because they've just gone through 2 world wars, World War I and World War II. And so they are reminded of the lessons that were not learned between World War I and World War II, and they were taught those lessons in fire and blood and anguish. The fire of battle, the blood of dead soldiers, the anguish of families and friends who lost them. So they understand this message entirely, and they understand the message about taking responsibility for our actions and learning our lessons for the future. The significance, of course, is that the Burling family do not learn their lessons, and so they are finally taught it before the end of the play, when the inspector is on his way. And then Sheila's going to be the last character I'll consider. I won't look at Eric and Gerald in this particular video, but there are others you can use. Sheila is described at the start, and she seems at the start to be a character who is very much a symbol of her father's capitalist lifestyle and comfortable within her father's capitalist lifestyle. She's described as being very pleased with life and rather excited. She looks at the ring, "Look, mummy, isn't it a beauty? I'll never let it out of my sight for an instant." And then she describes Eva Smith as being very pretty. She seems to embody that 1912 idea about the patriarchal society. So she's dependent on a man. She's very much appearance driven, focused on looks and material possessions. And she's also rather immature, very pleased with life and rather excited. And she calls her mother mummy. So there's a childish element to her. So whilst Priestley, I think, is encouraging the audience to react angrily towards Sheila, he also leaves her room to grow and develop, which he doesn't do for Burling and Mrs. Burling, and that's absolutely crucial. Sheila is a character who has to develop because she's the one who's going to carry Priestley's message after the inspector has gone. So becomes a symbol for progressive femininity and a reminder to the younger generation of the steps they need to take in order to better society. She takes on her father when she says these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. Significant quotation. She's rejecting the capitalist ideology of cheap labour. She is subverting the gender expectation because she's taking on her father when she should be subservient to him. And she's also recognising the collective femininity when she talks about these girls. She's placing herself alongside them in some way and recognising their humanity. At the end of Act 1, Sheila is in a position of dominance. She looks at Gerald as if in triumph he looks crushed. Gerald is reduced and Sheila is promoted, which is crucial for Priestley because in Act 2 and Act 3 we have to be listening to Sheila's message because she increasingly takes on Priestley's voice during the play, and she is definitely Priestley's voice after the inspector has left. She takes on her mother. Girls of that class, Mrs. Burling says, but the hyphen at the end of that is Sheila interrupting us. Then she says, "Mother, you mustn't try to build up a wall between us and the inspector." A couple of things that are significant here. She addresses her, Mrs. Burling, as mother. There's a growing maturity to Sheila. And she also rejects this idea of the wall. And the wall seems to me to be a symbol of a divide between the Burlings and the world outside and the working class. So it's a divide between the classes. And Sheila wants to break that wall down. She wants to break that divide down, as does Priestley. And then she recognises that they have responsibility. He was our police inspector, all right. She recognises that they need to accept what they've done and take responsibility for it. The ring, we're going to look at a couple of symbols now. The ring has symbolic significance in the play. At the beginning, it seems to be a symbol of capitalist wealth, but it's also a symbol of the patriarchy and Sheila's dependence on a man for her position in the world. Because she says, "Look, Mummy, isn't it a beauty? I'll never let it out of my sight for an instant." It's hugely important to her because it secures her position and her future. It's the one you wanted me to have. Gerald is making decisions for her and determining her future. But then later in the play, she hands that ring back. And in handing that ring back, she is therefore rejecting the capitalist ideology and the patriarchal attitudes that the ring symbolised at the beginning. And then doors and bells are a motif in this play, a recurring symbol throughout the play. We get the sharp ring of the doorbell and the telephone rings sharply at the end. Bells are an interruption from the outside world. They're kind of a message from that working class society which is otherwise absent from the play. And doors similarly serve a similar function. The door is a barrier between the Burlings and the outside world. It allows them to feel protected, to feel comfortable. And the inspector, at this point in the play, the inspector enters, leaving the door open behind him. Really significant moment because the inspector and therefore Priestley are exposing the Burlings to the outside world and therefore not allowing them to ignore the reality of that world or the issues they've caused anymore. To finish this, I'm going to have a look at a couple of examples about how you can write about character and symbols in the play. And this will really help because in An Inspector Calls, the language, in terms of your opportunities for analysis, the language is not as rich as in your novel, A Christmas Carol or Jekyll and Hyde, or in your Shakespeare play, whether you're doing Romeo and Juliet or Macbeth. But what you can analyse is the way in which the writer is using characters and symbols to convey particular messages. So here's one about the inspector. Priestley uses the inspector as a mouthpiece to express his own socialist ideology. This is why in his opening stage direction, the inspector creates at once an impression of massiveness. He is more than just a man and a character. He is a symbol, a voice, and a representative figure for the working classes who are otherwise denied a role in the play. He must also be metaphorically the largest presence on stage, as his is the message we need to hear if Priestley is to achieve his purpose in the play. Hopefully you can see there's a lot about the way in which Priestley is using the inspector. And even though there's only one quotation in there, you're going to get a lot of marks for AO2 if you are talking about how Priestley is employing characters and symbols in order to create meaning. So we'll have another look at one with a symbol now. I'm going to look at the doors and bells. So Priestley employs doors and bells as significant motifs within his allegorical play. The door is a barrier between the Burlings and the reality of the outside world. It provides them with comfort and protection within their capitalist bubble. It is significant, therefore, that Priestley disrupts this with the sharp ring of the doorbell, an interruption from the working class society outside the Burling home, and when the inspector enters, leaving the door open behind him, Priestley ensures that the Burlings are exposed to the world outside and can no longer hide from the consequences of their actions. Again, just a couple of quotations in here, but I'm analysing the way in which Priestley is using symbols to create meaning and impact his audience. So you could do that with any character or any symbol in the play, and I would encourage you to practice those paragraphs in advance of your exam. So a few useful phrases that might aid you in that process. Priestley uses Sheila, Eric the inspector, Mr. Burling, whichever character you choose, as a vehicle to express or convey, and then you can talk about how he's using that character. In his allegorical play, the setting of the dining room acts as a symbol for, and you can talk about the symbolic significance of the dining room and bring in quotations to support that. Or Priestley employs the motif of the ring to convey his ideas about. Again, quotations will be useful there, but even if you analyse what he's using the ring for, you're going to get significant marks for AO2. Hope that was a useful look at An Inspector Calls. Please go away now. You might choose to look at my video on An Inspector Calls key quotations as well if you want to have a look at the other characters, in particular Eric and Gerald.